He walked to school every morning with the same heavy feeling in his chest. The sun was just rising, but he already felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. His shoes were old, the soles worn thin, and sometimes water would leak in when it rained. He tugged at his threadbare jacket, wishing he had something warmer, something that didn't make him feel invisible. People didn't notice him much, and when they did, it was usually with pity or ridicule. The neighborhood he lived in wasn't rich. In fact, most families were scraping by, just like his own. But that never seemed to matter to the bullies who waited for him at school. They were bigger, stronger, and louder, and they seemed to take pleasure in making him feel small. Every morning he walked past them, head down, hoping they wouldn't see him. But somehow, they always did. Their sneers cut through him like ice, and their laughter followed him long after he had escaped. Poor boy, they called him. Weakling, loser. The words echoed in his mind, becoming part of his own thoughts, even when he tried to ignore them. He wasn't weak, not really. He was careful, thoughtful, and quick to notice things that others missed. But that didn't matter in a world that seemed to value strength over everything else. At home, things were no easier. His parents worked long hours just to keep food on the table, and there was little time left for warmth or comfort. His father came home exhausted, his hands rough and calloused, and his mother's eyes carried the weariness of someone who had given everything and received very little. Sometimes he felt like he was invisible even to them. Still, he had his dreams. They were small at first, almost embarrassing to even admit to himself. He wanted a life where he didn't have to feel fear every morning. A life where he could walk into a room and not be laughed at. He wanted respect, not from anyone in particular, but just to feel like he belonged somewhere. He imagined it quietly when no one was looking, scribbling ideas in a worn notebook or daydreaming in the corner of the classroom. School was hard. The bullies never let him forget his place. They tripped him in the hallways, pushed him into lockers, and whispered cruel jokes whenever a teacher turned their back. Some of the other students laughed, too afraid to be the next target. He learned quickly not to fight back openly. Not because he didn't want to, but because fighting didn't solve anything. It only made things worse. So, he learned to endure, to keep his head down, to hide his emotions like a shield. Inside, though, he was burning with a quiet determination. A tiny flame that refused to go out no matter how hard they tried to snuff it. One day, as he sat under the old oak tree at the edge of the playground, he watched the others laughing and running, their lives so different from his. He wondered what it would be like to have money, to have freedom, to make choices without worrying if the next meal would be enough. He wondered what it would feel like to stand tall without fear. The questions were dangerous in their own way, because they made him realize just how much he lacked. But they also gave him something to cling to, a vision of a different life. He wasn't alone in his struggle, though he often felt like he was. There were a few teachers who noticed him, who saw the intelligence behind the quiet exterior. They would nod at him in the hallways, smile when he answered a question correctly, or leave a kind word in his notebook. Those small gestures were like lifelines, reminders that maybe he wasn't invisible after all. Sometimes a fellow student would sit with him, sharing a sandwich or a joke. A fleeting moment of kindness that made the day a little easier to bear. But mostly, it was him against the world, learning to survive quietly, learning to observe, learning to plan. His home life, though full of love in its own way, was never easy. Meals were often simple, sometimes barely enough, and the house itself showed signs of long years of struggle. The floors creaked, the paint peeled, and the windows rattled whenever the wind blew too hard. Still, it was his shelter, the place he returned to each night, carrying the bruises, the embarrassment, and the loneliness of the day. Sometimes, when he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he would imagine a world where he could live differently, where he could leave the worries behind, where he could create something that mattered. Even in his lowest moments, there was a spark inside him that refused to die. He discovered early on that knowledge was his power, the one thing the bullies couldn't take away. He would read anything he could get his hands on: old textbooks, library books, discarded newspapers. Each page was a window into a world beyond the narrow streets he walked every day. He learned about inventions, business, people who had risen from nothing to achieve greatness. These stories fueled him. They whispered that maybe he, too, could find a way out. Yet, success felt tiny in comparison to the mountain he faced daily. A good grade on a test brought a small smile, quickly erased by the memory of the teasing at lunch. A clever idea shared quietly in class was often ignored, overshadowed by louder, bolder voices. It was exhausting, this constant battle to prove himself in a world that seemed determined to see him fail. And still, he endured. There were days when he wanted to give up entirely. Days when he imagined running away from it all, leaving the town, leaving the school, leaving the bullies to live their easy lives without him in the way. But something always stopped him. A voice in his mind, soft but persistent, reminded him that giving up was exactly what they wanted. That quitting would mean letting the cruelty win. And he refused to let that happen. At times he found solace in small victories. A teacher's praise, a friend's encouragement. Finishing a difficult assignment on his own, these were moments that reminded him he had worth beyond what others saw. They were tiny sparks, but enough to keep the flame alive. And each day, even when it felt impossible, he held on to that hope that one day, things could be different. One afternoon, as the bullies cornered him near the school fence, he felt the familiar surge of fear and humiliation. They shoved him against the fence, laughing and mocking his shabby clothes. But this time, something inside him shifted. Instead of cowering, he looked at them calmly, almost curiously, as if he were studying their behavior. He noticed their overconfidence, their reliance on fear to control others. He noticed the cracks in their own arrogance. It was a small observation, almost insignificant. But it gave him a strange sense of power, a reminder that strength wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and invisible until it was too late for others to see. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, writing down his thoughts, his ideas, his plans. He didn't know exactly what he was planning yet, but he knew he wanted more. More than what the bullies could take away, more than what his circumstances seemed to allow. He wanted a future where he could look back at these moments, not with bitterness, but with pride, where he could rise above the laughter and the cruelty, not to hurt anyone, but to prove to himself that he could. Sleep came late that night, and when he finally closed his eyes, the dreams that filled his mind were not of escape, but of achievement. He imagined himself walking through doors that had always been closed, sitting in rooms where people listened when he spoke, and living a life where fear and mockery no longer had a place. And in that quiet, dark room, with the sounds of the city outside and the hum of a small lamp on the table, he made a silent promise to himself. One day, he would change everything. Not immediately, not easily, but inevitably. The days that followed were the same in some ways. He walked to school, endured the jeers, and came home tired and hungry. But inside, something had shifted. He began noticing opportunities where others saw none. He watched people, listened to conversations, and thought about how the world worked. He paid attention to the small details, the way money moved, the way influence spread, the way people judged each other based on appearances. He realized that the world might see him as weak and poor, but it was blind to the strength that lived quietly inside him, waiting for the right moment. And so, life continued. A mix of struggle and quiet determination. Each day was a test of patience, each insult a reminder of why he had to rise above. The boy who everyone thought was nothing had begun building a foundation, brick by brick, for a future that even the bullies could not imagine. And though the world did not yet know it, his story was only beginning. After the promise he made to himself under the dim light of the kitchen lamp, the boy started to change in ways that nobody else noticed at first. On the surface, he was still the same quiet, poor boy who walked to school with his patched-up shoes and worn jacket. He still endured the bullies, still sat in the back of classrooms, still came home to a house filled with the quiet struggles of his family. But inside, something was different. He had begun to understand that the world didn't have to define him. He could, slowly and quietly, shape his own future. The first step was learning. He realized that knowledge was more powerful than strength, more permanent than any insult. At school, he started paying attention in ways he hadn't before. Even if the teacher was talking about something he already knew, he would listen, take notes, and think about how it could be applied to the world outside the classroom. Math became more than just numbers. It was logic, strategy, a way to see patterns where others saw chaos. Reading became a doorway into minds that had lived completely different lives. People who had achieved greatness, despite circumstances far worse than his. He couldn't afford extra books or tutors, so he made use of what he had. The school library became his second home. He spent hours there after classes, poring over books on business, invention, science, and history. Sometimes he took notes in the margins of library books, careful not to damage them, dreaming about the possibilities those words suggested. He read stories of people who had started with nothing, who had been underestimated and yet had changed the world. Each story felt like a secret message meant just for him. It whispered that he could do it too, if only he stayed patient and focused. At home, he started helping his parents more. He took on small jobs around the neighborhood running errands, cleaning, delivering packages, anything that earned a few extra coins. The work was hard, exhausting even, but he never complained. Each coin he earned was more than money. It was a small victory, proof that he could create his own opportunities. He would carefully save, hiding small stacks of coins in old jars, imagining them as seeds for the life he wanted to grow. Sometimes his parents noticed, sometimes they didn't, but he didn't do it for their approval. He did it for himself. The bullies at school continued to torment him, as relentless as ever. They shoved him in the hallways, tripped him in the cafeteria, and whispered cruel jokes about his family. Some days, the words stung more than the physical blows. But now, instead of letting them break him, he started studying them. He watched how they interacted, how they reacted to attention, how they used fear to control those around them. He realized that their power was mostly illusion. They were loud, aggressive, and confident, but not clever. They relied on people's fear, not on real skill. That realization didn't make him brave enough to fight them directly, but it gave him something more valuable: insight. One afternoon, after a particularly harsh encounter, he sat on the steps outside the school, bruised and exhausted. A younger student approached him quietly, offering a sandwich. "You dropped this in the cafeteria," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't much, but it was kindness, and in that moment, it felt enormous. The simple act reminded him that not everyone in the world was cruel. Some people were quietly good, quietly brave, and quietly supportive. That small kindness sparked something inside him. A quiet but growing belief that he could build a world around him where goodness mattered more than cruelty. Around the same time, teacher noticed his determination. She wasn't flashy or loud, but she had a sharp eye for talent. She started giving him small challenges, extra assignments that stretched his thinking. "I think you can do more than you realize," she said one day, handing him a complex math problem with a faint smile. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he could meet the challenge. But he tried anyway, staying up late into the night to work through it. When he finally solved it, the teacher looked at him with something like pride, and in that moment, he realized he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. Encouraged by the small victories, he began experimenting with ideas of his own. He didn't have much money, so he had to be creative. He started making small inventions from scraps he could find at home or at the local junkyard. Sometimes a simple device to make a task easier, sometimes a clever solution to a problem that people complained about every day. It wasn't much, but it was his first taste of creating something of value. It thrilled him. His confidence didn't grow overnight. There were nights when he lay awake, thinking about how unfair life was, how much he was still lacking. He thought about the bullies, about the mocking classmates, about the small cramped apartment he called home. He wondered if he was dreaming too big, if he was chasing something that would never come. But every time he felt doubt creeping in, he remembered the moments when he had triumphed quietly, when he solved a difficult problem, when someone noticed his effort, when he earned a coin for work he had done well. Those moments were proof that he was moving forward, even if the world didn't see it. One of his first real projects was small, okay? almost laughable, but it taught him a lesson that would stay with him forever. He noticed that in the neighborhood, many people had trouble carrying groceries or water from the market. He fashioned a simple cart using old wheels, scrap wood, and rope. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly didn't look fancy, but it worked. People started asking to borrow it, and a few even offered him a small payment for it. It was tiny, almost nothing in the grand scheme of things, but it gave him a taste of what it felt like to create value, to make life easier for others, and even to earn respect quietly. Without confrontation, as he experimented, he learned about patience. Some projects failed completely, sometimes spectacularly. A cart would collapse under a load, a small invention wouldn't work as planned, or a plan to sell something would fall apart. Each failure stung, but he began to see them not as defeats, but as lessons. The world wasn't cruel because he was weak. It was cruel because it was unpredictable. And the only way to survive was to learn from mistakes, to adapt, and to keep moving forward. At school, the bullies remained the same, but he no longer feared them as much. He still avoided direct confrontation, still kept his head down in public, but inside he felt a quiet power. The power of knowledge, of preparation, of foresight. He realized that he didn't need to match their strength. He needed to match their cleverness, and then surpass it in ways they couldn't even imagine. Slowly, his life began to change in small, almost invisible ways. A neighbor asked him to help fix a small appliance. A friend invited him to study together. A teacher asked him to assist with a school project. These weren't huge milestones, but they were threads, weaving a new reality around him. A reality in which he had skill, resourcefulness, and determination qualities the bullies could never understand. His evenings became sacred. After the chores and part-time work, he would sit with a notebook, sketching ideas, calculating, and imagining solutions to problems. Sometimes it was a business idea, sometimes a mechanical invention, sometimes a way to improve life in the neighborhood. Each idea, each calculation, each note was a seed planted for the future. He began to understand that the difference between the life he had and the life he wanted wasn't luck. It was preparation. It was knowledge. It was patience. And it was a belief in himself that no one could take away. Even when discouragement struck, he found ways to fight it quietly. One evening, after being pushed into a puddle by the same bullies who had mocked him for years, he went home, soaked and shivering. Instead of crying or lashing out, he stripped off the wet clothes, sat at his desk, and worked on a problem he had been stuck on for days. By the time he finished, the bruises and the cold seemed smaller, almost insignificant compared to the thrill of solving something that had challenged him. It was a small victory, but it was his, entirely his. In time, he began to see the first glimpses of opportunity. A local shopkeeper asked him to manage small deliveries. A teacher offered to help him find books he could not afford, and a friend mentioned a contest that involved building a simple machine for school. Each opportunity was modest, but he seized them all. He worked late, stayed after school, experimented at home. Slowly, step by step, he was building a foundation, a quiet network of skills, experience, and small successes that nobody could take away. Through it all, he never lost sight of the world that had seemed so cruel. He remembered the bullies, the mocking laughter, the cold nights at home, the empty pockets. Those memories weren't anchors. They were fuel. Every insult, every shove, every glance of pity was a reminder of why he had to rise, why he had to become someone the world couldn't ignore. By the end of the second year of his new approach, he had grown in ways that weren't visible on the outside. He was still the same boy in worn clothes, still careful not to draw attention, still avoiding direct confrontation. But inside he was different. He had patience, resilience, skill, and a quiet confidence that no one had yet earned the right to see. He had learned that life could be cruel, but it was also filled with tiny moments of hope, of kindness, of opportunity. If only one had the eyes to see them. And though the bullies continued to mock him, and though life remained hard, the boy knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was no longer helpless. He was learning, building, preparing. He was planting seeds for a future that was entirely his own. And one day, those seeds would grow into something the world could not ignore, the quiet flame that had started under the dim lamp in his kitchen had grown. It wasn't roaring or bright yet, but it was steady, and it was alive. And for the first time in his life, the boy felt a truth that no bully, no hardship, and no circumstance could take away. He was on a path that was his own, and nothing could stop him from moving forward. The boy had been quietly building his skills for years, always careful to keep his ambitions hidden from those around him. To everyone else, he was still the same quiet, poor student, navigating the hallways with his head down, enduring the cruel jabs and laughter of the bullies. But inside, he was no longer the timid boy who once feared every step. He had grown stronger, not in muscles or size, but in mind, in strategy, in resilience. He had learned patience, the kind of patience that came not from waiting for luck, but from preparing for the moment when opportunity would finally arrive. Opportunity came in small, almost invisible ways at first. A local competition was announced for students to create simple inventions or projects that could solve everyday problems. Most of his classmates ignored it, seeing it as a distraction or a game for nerds. The bullies, of course, laughed at the idea outright. "What could you possibly make, poor boy?" One of them sneered. "You can barely even buy materials." He didn't respond. He simply listened and stored their words, letting them fuel a quiet fire within him. He spent the next few weeks planning. Money was tight, so he scavenged for scraps, old electronics, bits of wood, and anything that could be turned into a project. He worked late into the night after chores, after homework, after small jobs that helped his family get by. His hands were often scraped, his eyes tired. Sometimes his back ached from hours, hunched over a desk or bending over scraps on the floor. But he was driven by a vision, one that had become sharper with each passing day. He decided to create a small, mechanical device that could make carrying heavy items easier for people in his neighborhood. The idea was simple, but its design required careful thought. He sketched, measured, cut, and assembled pieces, testing and adjusting again and again. Many nights ended with failure, a wheel breaking, a lever snapping, or a connection falling apart. Each time, he sighed, cleaned up the mess, and began again. Giving up was not an option. Each failure taught him something new, how to make it stronger, more efficient, and easier to use. At school, he kept his project hidden, worried that the bullies would mock him before he even had a chance to prove himself. He watched them, learning from their overconfidence, their lack of careful thinking. He realized that they were loud and bold because they had never faced real obstacles. They relied on fear to control others, but fear had no hold over him anymore. He had endured years of it, and it had only sharpened his mind and strengthened his resolve. The day of the competition arrived. The boy carried his creation carefully in a small box, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. When he entered the room, he saw students with sleek, polished projects, colorful posters, and neat presentations. For a moment, doubt crept in. His own project was simple, practical, a little rough around the edges. Would anyone notice its value? Would anyone appreciate the time and effort he had poured into it? The judges, however, were interested in practicality and innovation rather than appearance. When he demonstrated his device, showing how it could make everyday tasks easier, their eyes lit up. They asked questions about materials, design, and cost, and he answered with confidence, explaining each step of the process and the problems he had solved along the way. By the end of his demonstration, it was clear that his work had impressed them far more than the flashy projects around him. To his quiet surprise, he won the competition. It's not first place at a school level, not by luck, but by merit. His creation had solved a real problem, and the judges recognized the ingenuity, effort, and thought behind it. For the first time, the boy felt what it was like to be acknowledged for his intelligence, creativity, and hard work. The recognition was exhilarating, but it also brought something else: the attention of the bullies. At first they didn't believe it. "There's no way that loser actually won," one of them muttered. But when they saw him being applauded, when they saw teachers and peers congratulating him, they realized the truth. Their laughter turned into disbelief, their sneers into awkward silence. For once, he didn't feel fear, only a quiet sense of triumph. The boy had not sought revenge, had not tried to humiliate them. But his success spoke louder than any words could. That victory marked the first turning point in his life. It gave him confidence, yes, but it also taught him something more important. The world rewarded effort, ingenuity, and persistence, more than appearances or loudness. He began to see a path forward, one where he could rise beyond the limitations of his circumstances, beyond the mockery of the bullies, beyond the struggles of his family. Each small success became a building block, each lesson learned a step, toward a future he was beginning to imagine in vivid detail. He didn't stop with the competition. Encouraged by the outcome, he started exploring other ways to use his skills. He noticed small inefficiencies around him, how deliveries were slow at the local market, how people struggled with everyday chores, how simple problems went unsolved because nobody took the time to think creatively. He began experimenting with solutions, testing ideas quietly, failing often, but learning faster with each attempt. Each small improvement, each tiny success, added to his growing belief that he could achieve something remarkable. At home, he continued to help his parents, though now he also shared a quiet confidence. He would show them his small inventions, his ideas for improvement. And while they didn't fully understand the technical details, they could see the effort, ingenuity, and determination. Their pride in him grew, and though they never had much to give, they offered encouragement in their own quiet way. That encouragement became another seed, another reason to keep pushing forward. The bullies, meanwhile, remained a background threat, a reminder of the world's cruelty. But the boy had changed. He no longer feared them in the same way. When they mocked him, he smiled inwardly, knowing that their power over him had diminished. Their strength was temporary, based on intimidation. But his strength was growing quietly, steadily, in ways they could not see. He had learned the first secret of resilience. True strength is often invisible, until it is too late for others to resist. His confidence began to spill into other areas. He started paying more attention in class, answering questions with a quiet certainty, helping other students who struggled. Some classmates began to notice, some teachers took more interest, and slowly he built a reputation, not as the poor, weak boy, but as someone capable, clever, and determined. It was subtle, gradual, but it mattered. The boy was no longer invisible. Around this time, a mentor appeared. Someone who noticed not only his talent, but also his determination. It could have been a teacher, a local business owner, or someone connected to the school. This mentor provided guidance, advice, and encouragement. They offered him small projects, challenged him to think bigger, and, most importantly, believed in his potential when few others did. The boy absorbed everything, listening carefully, asking questions, and applying what he learned with relentless focus. One summer, with guidance from his mentor, he started a small business venture. He identified a local need, something simple that people required daily but found difficult to access. With almost no money, he used the skills he had developed. Over the years, creativity, resourcefulness, and problem-solving. The first attempts were shaky, fraught with mistakes, missed deliveries, and miscalculations. Each failure stung, but he never gave up. Each correction, each adjustment brought him closer to success. By the end of the summer, he'd built a small but functioning operation. It was modest, far from the riches he dreamed of, but it was a start. And in that small success, he found proof that he could create real change, that his efforts could bear fruit, that his vision of a life beyond struggle was possible, he realized. That he didn't need to be a giant immediately. He only needed to keep moving, step by step, toward something greater. The bullies, still present in his life, could no longer intimidate him. One of them tried to mock him after seeing him selling his small products, but he simply smiled, continued his work, and ignored the words. The power dynamic had shifted, not dramatically, not publicly, but internally. The boy had found something they could never take away, self-belief, skill, and the knowledge that he was capable of more than they could ever imagine. By the end of this part of his journey, he had begun to realize something profound. Success was not about instant recognition, flashy wealth, or public admiration. Success was about persistence, learning from failures, finding solutions where others saw problems, and quietly building strength and skill every day. The world outside could remain cruel and unfair, but he had discovered a power within himself that could not be stolen. And so, the boy, still quiet, still seemingly ordinary, began a journey that would change his life forever. The small victories, the lessons from failure, the mentorship, and the first real taste of achievement were all pieces of a foundation. He was building a foundation strong enough to carry him beyond the limitations of poverty, beyond the cruelty of bullies, and into a future where he could finally stand tall on his own terms. Years passed, and the boy who once walked to school in worn shoes and a threadbare jacket was no longer a boy in spirit. The small victories of his youth, the quiet successes he had built in secret, had shaped him into someone steady, disciplined, and thoughtful. He still remembered every insult, every shove, every mocking laugh from the bullies who had once made his life miserable. But he no longer carried fear. Instead, he carried ambition, patience, and a plan that had been years in the making. By now, he had left his school days behind, but the lessons he had learned stayed with him. Every failure had taught him resilience. Every small triumph had taught him that effort mattered more than luck. Every act of kindness, every small mentorship, had shown him that the world was not entirely cruel, and that some people could be trusted to help without asking for anything in return. He remembered them all, tucked away like tools in a toolbox, ready to be used when the time was right. The first real turning point into adulthood came with his venture into the wider world. The small business he had started in his youth had grown slowly but steadily. Each step forward required creativity, patience, and an ability to navigate challenges that most people would have found overwhelming. Money was tight, but he reinvested every penny, always thinking ahead, always planning for a future that others could not yet see. He worked long hours, often alone. Driven by a quiet vision of independence and success, he learned to understand people, what motivated them, what frustrated them, what inspired loyalty and trust. He had learned long ago that the bully's strength was only on the surface, and he realized that real influence came from understanding the world and the people in it. He began building connections carefully, quietly, gaining respect not through intimidation, but through competence and integrity. People started to notice. Slowly, some former classmates, neighbors, and even teachers began to see him as capable, reliable, and intelligent. But they had no idea of the wealth and influence he would one day achieve. They only saw a man who was steadily building something meaningful alongside his business ventures, never forgot his roots. The struggles of his youth, the poverty of his family, the laughter of the bullies, they were all reminders of where he had come from and what he could never forget. He sometimes returned to the neighborhood, helping quietly with local problems, giving advice, or providing resources to those in need. It was never for show, never for recognition. It was a promise he had made to himself long ago, that he would never forget the boy he had been. The bullies, meanwhile, had moved on with their own lives, unaware that the quiet, poor boy they had mocked so easily was no longer the same person. Some were stuck in jobs that paid barely enough to get by. Some had small businesses that struggled to survive. The world had treated them as they treated others, without mercy for laziness, arrogance, or cruelty. And while he did not seek revenge, he felt a quiet sense of justice, knowing that his persistence, skill, and patience had carried him to a place they could never imagine. By his the man had transformed his small ventures into a network of businesses. He had learned to invest wisely, to take calculated risks, and to surround himself with people who were smarter and more experienced than he was. He never forgot the lessons of his youth, how important it was to learn, to observe, and to remain patient. The world was still unpredictable, but now he had the tools to shape it, rather than be shaped by it. He also discovered the power of vision. He began thinking not just about survival, not just about profit, but about impact. He wanted to create something lasting, something meaningful, something that would change lives, not just his own. He started funding projects that helped communities, businesses that improved lives, and initiatives that gave opportunities to those who, like him, had once been overlooked. It wasn't charity for the sake of recognition. It was an extension of his belief that a better world was possible when people were given the tools and opportunities to succeed. As his businesses grew, so did his reputation. He became known for his integrity, his strategic thinking, and his ability to see opportunities where others saw none. Investors, clients, and partners began to trust him with larger projects, more complex deals, and higher stakes. He learned to navigate these new challenges with calm and precision, drawing on the patience and perseverance that had defined his youth. Each decision, each calculated risk, brought him closer to the life he had envisioned years ago under the dim light of a kitchen lamp. Despite his success, he remained humble, aware of how far he had come and how much he had endured. He never flaunted wealth or power. He understood that true respect came not from what one owned, but from how one treated others. His early experiences with bullies had taught him that cruelty was never a mark of strength, and he lived by that lesson. He treated people fairly, rewarded effort, and extended kindness wherever it was needed, quietly building loyalty and admiration rather than fear. One day, he returned to his old neighborhood for a business meeting. As he walked through streets he had known as a child, memories flooded back of cold mornings, of laughter that hurt more than it comforted, of evenings spent studying by dim light while others slept in comfort. He noticed familiar faces, some of whom remembered him as the shy, poor boy. They were polite, curious, and a little unsure of how to treat him now. But he walked with confidence, a quiet assurance that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he had achieved. It wasn't just the neighborhood that reflected his journey. It was also his inner world. He had grown into someone capable of seeing challenges clearly, of responding to them calmly, and of acting decisively. He had learned that power without purpose was meaningless, that wealth without direction could vanish as quickly as it arrived, and that the lessons of his youth, resilience, patience, observation, kindness were far more valuable than any money or title he could acquire. The bullies, meanwhile, were completely unprepared for the man he had become. They had never imagined that the boy they had mocked so easily would rise so far, so quickly, and so quietly. Some recognized him now, unable to hide their shock, their uncertainty, their small measure of awe, but he didn't confront them directly. He let his success speak for itself, a silent testament to what years of determination, focus, and patience could achieve. He had learned that the loudest voices in youth often faded into insignificance in the face of skill, vision, and relentless effort. His life continued to expand in new directions. He invested in technology, in business ventures, and in innovative solutions to problems he had seen firsthand as a child. Each decision was calculated, each risk measured, each step deliberate, and each success, each milestone, reminded him of the boy who had walked to school every morning in worn shoes, who had endured cruelty without breaking, who had dreamed quietly while others laughed. That boy had never disappeared. He had become the foundation of the man he was today. As he looked around one evening in his office, high above the city, he realized just how far he had come. The skyline stretched before him, glittering with lights, reflection of the world he had learned to navigate, influence, and improve. And in that moment, he understood something profound. Success wasn't measured by money alone. It was measured by growth, by resilience, by the ability to transform hardship into opportunity, and by the courage to rise above cruelty without letting it harden the heart. Yet, despite all of this, he felt a quiet pull toward the past. The neighborhood, the school, the streets he had once walked, they all reminded him of the journey he had taken, of the boy who had refused to give up despite the odds, and he knew that one day he would confront the echoes of his past not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a calm strength that only years of struggle and perseverance could give. The bullies, the peers who had laughed at him, The teachers and neighbors who had doubted him, they were all part of the story. And he had grown too far to be defined by their opinions anymore by now. The man was recognized not only for his business acumen, but also for his vision and character. Opportunities he had once only dreamed of were now realities. Partnerships, ventures, and projects stretched across cities and industries. Each one a testament to the patience, skill, and resilience he had cultivated since childhood. He had learned that true success was not sudden or flashy. It was slow, steady, and rooted in a lifetime of quiet, deliberate effort. Even as he built an empire, he remained grounded. He visited schools, mentored young people, helped struggling entrepreneurs, quietly gave back to communities that reminded him of where he had started. He understood that his journey had been shaped by more than his own effort. It had been shaped by teachers who had believed in him, mentors who had guided him, and moments of kindness that had kept his spirit alive. He wanted to pass that forward, to give others the same opportunities he had worked so hard to create for himself. The transformation was complete. The boy who had once been mocked and ignored had become a man of influence, intelligence, and quiet power. And yet he remained humble, always aware of the journey, always remembering the struggles that had defined him. The bullies, who had once thought themselves powerful, could only watch in disbelief, unsure of how to react to the man who had risen so far, so quietly, and with such purpose, and in the stillness of his own thoughts. He smiled not out of pride or revenge, but out of recognition for the journey he had taken, for the boy he had once been, and for the man he had become. He had endured, learned, grown, and transformed. Nothing could ever take that away. Years had passed since the boy who once walked to school in tattered shoes had faced the cruelty of the bullies. The small, quiet victories of his youth had grown into a life of skill, intelligence, and influence. He had built businesses, created opportunities, and helped people along the way, all while keeping humility and patience at the center of his life. Yet the memory of those cruel laughs, the shoves in hallways, and the whispers that had once cut so deeply remained with him, not as bitterness, but as reminders of how far he had come and how much he had endured. One afternoon, he returned to the city where he had grown up. The visit was for business, but part of him wanted to see the streets, the school, the neighborhood that had shaped his journey. He walked through familiar streets, noticing the changes and the people who had stayed the same. He passed the corner where the bullies had once waited to torment him. A few of them were still there, older now, their confidence diminished by years of life that had not treated them as kindly as they had hoped. When they recognized him, their expressions changed immediately. At first, there was disbelief, as if their eyes could not comprehend what they were seeing. The quiet, poor boy they had mocked so easily had grown into a man of stature, confidence, and unmistakable presence. Some of them tried to mask it with a casual greeting, but the tension was unmistakable. They remembered every cruel word, every shove, every sneer they had directed at him. And now they were faced with the living proof that he had risen far above them. He smiled quietly, not with malice or revenge, but with calm assurance. There was no need for confrontation, no need to shout or humiliate. His success, his confidence, and his quiet strength spoke louder than any words ever could. The bullies looked at him, unsure whether to feel shame, envy, or admiration. Some tried to joke, trying to cling to the remnants of their old arrogance, but their voices faltered. The boy they had thought weak was now undeniably powerful in ways they could not have imagined. As he walked past them, he noticed the subtle changes in their demeanor. One of them avoided eye contact entirely. Another shifted nervously, as if realizing for the first time that cruelty does not build true strength. And yet he did not gloat. He simply carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured and learned. Someone who had taken every insult and turned it into fuel for growth. His life had become a testament to patience, perseverance, and the ability to rise above cruelty without letting it define him. The man continued through the neighborhood, visiting his old school not to prove anything, but to see the place where it all had begun. He walked the halls, noticing small changes, but also the familiar marks of time. He remembered the classrooms, the teachers who had guided him, the few classmates who had been quietly kind. and he remembered the moments of isolation, the fear, and the humiliation that had once seemed unbearable. Each memory was a reminder of the path he had traveled, of the effort, courage, and intelligence that had carried him to this point. He had arranged a meeting at the local community center, ostensibly for a business purpose, but in reality, it was also an opportunity to give back to the neighborhood that had shaped him. People gathered, curious about the man who had quietly become so successful. Among them were some former classmates, some of the bullies and neighbors, who had known him as a quiet, poor boy. The atmosphere was thick with curiosity and anticipation. When he spoke to the crowd, it was not about wealth or power. He spoke about opportunity, about resilience, about the ability to rise above hardship through effort, patience, and learning. He shared stories of his youth, of failures and small victories, of the teachers and mentors who had guided him, and the small acts of kindness that had kept him moving forward. People listened, captivated by the story of a life transformed by determination and vision. The bullies, now older, could not hide their shock. They listened as he spoke, realizing for the first time the magnitude of his achievements. He described the businesses he had built, the ventures he had undertaken, and the projects that had helped communities thrive. He did not boast. He merely shared the truth, a truth that was undeniable. The boy they had mocked had become a man whose influence reached far beyond what they could have imagined. After the speech, he mingled with the crowd quietly. Some approached him, asking questions, seeking advice, or expressing admiration. The bullies lingered, unsure whether to approach, unsure whether to apologize, unsure whether they could even recognize him as the same person they had once ridiculed. He looked at them calmly, without anger, without a hint of vindictiveness. Their discomfort was not something he orchestrated. It was a natural consequence of their own choices and the life they had lived. One of the bullies finally spoke. Hesitating, "Is it really you?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. The man nodded, smiling softly. "Yes, it's me," he said. "I'm the same boy you used to laugh at." The room grew quiet. The words hung in the air, heavy with memory and meaning. The former bully shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing for the first time that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. The man continued, "Not to humiliate, but to teach. I am not here to punish anyone," he said. "I am here to show what is possible when you refuse to let fear, cruelty, or circumstance define you. You have the power to change, just as I had the power to change. Life is not about what others do to you. It's about what you do with yourself." His words were calm, firm, and full of the quiet authority that comes from lived experience. Some of the bullies looked down, ashamed. Some realized that they had wasted years chasing arrogance and pride while he had built a life quietly and meaningfully. They felt a mix of envy, regret, and newfound respect. They could no longer see him as the weak boy they had mocked. He had transcended that label entirely, and in doing so, he had shown them a lesson that could not be taught through anger or force. The man moved on to the rest of the crowd, speaking with neighbors, former classmates, and children who were now old enough to understand the power of determination. He shared practical advice, teaching them that even small steps could lead to profound change. He emphasized patience, resilience, and the importance of seizing opportunities, however small. His words resonated deeply because they were not theoretical. They were lived, real, and earned through years of struggle and effort. As the event came to an end, he walked outside, looking at the streets he had once navigated with fear and uncertainty. He remembered the nights he had stayed up, working on small inventions, earning a few coins, and dreaming quietly of a life beyond struggle. Every failure, every insult, every moment of doubt had been a step on the path to this very moment. And now, standing there, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not because of wealth or recognition, but because he had remained true to himself, had worked relentlessly, and had turned hardship into opportunity. The bullies watched him leave, still unsure how to respond. They had once believed themselves powerful, but the truth was undeniable. The boy they had mocked had become a man of intelligence, influence, and quiet strength. Their fear and discomfort were not punishment. They were the natural result of having underestimated someone they thought they could control. They had learned, albeit belatedly, that cruelty is never a foundation for lasting power. Back in his own quiet office that evening, the man reflected on the journey he had taken. He had endured poverty, humiliation, and isolation. He had faced the relentless mockery of those who saw only weakness. He had failed countless times, often in ways that felt devastating in the moment. Yet, through all of it, he had persevered. He had learned, adapted, and grown. And now he had achieved a life that reflected not just skill or wealth, but wisdom, integrity, and resilience. He realized that his story was not just about success or revenge. It was about the power of perseverance, about the importance of learning from failure, about the strength that comes from enduring hardship without losing sight of your goals. It was a story that could inspire others who felt small, powerless, or overlooked. It was proof that life does not have to be defined by the cruelty of others. That determination and patience can lead to transformation beyond imagination. Even as he thought of the bullies, he felt no desire for revenge. They had taught him lessons, 2 lessons about patience, observation, and the value of quiet strength. He had taken their cruelty and turned it into fuel for growth. And in that, he had found something more valuable than anything money could buy: the knowledge that he could define his own destiny, no matter the obstacles. As night fell over the city, he looked out the window, thinking of the boy who had once walked to school with fear in his chest. That boy had survived. That boy had persevered. And that boy had become a man who could walk confidently through life, knowing that no one could take away the strength, skill, and resilience he had built over years of quiet effort. And so, the story of the boy who had once been mocked ended not with anger, not with humiliation, but with triumph of patience, perseverance, intelligence, and the quiet, unstoppable force of a person who refused to let the world define them. The boy who was once thought weak and poor had become a man whose life was a testament to what is possible. When determination meets opportunity, when resilience meets skill, and when hope meets action, the bullies, the neighborhood, and the world could only watch. The boy they had underestimated had become everything they never expected. Not by force, not by anger, but by quietly building, learning, and rising above. And in that rise, he had shown something far greater than wealth or power. He had shown the power of the human spirit.